We are almost in the home stretch of Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life in Antidote to Chaos. Almost. We are starting Rule 11. Do not bother children when they are skateboarding. For fun, put your guesses as to what this chapter is actually about in the comments below. Here's a hint, which probably won't be surprising if you've been following the series for any stretch of time. Most of this chapter is only tangentially related to skateboarding, or kids. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi! Welcome back to the channel. This chapter is a bit of a hodgepodge of the different social ills Peterson sees with the world, to the point that there are 11 sections in this chapter alone. The previous record holder was Rule 1 with 10 sections, and some of the sections are less than a page in length, but still, it isn't going to be a single standalone video for this chapter. To address the Chaos Dragon in the room, I'm not going to buy the Chaos Dragon neck pillow I brought up as a suggested sale when I got this guy as an impulse buy on Amazon. I'm sorry. I know some of you are disappointed, but I have plenty of things. To the point that, going through some stuff looking for other things, I found this guy in the closet, so I had the Chaos Dragon all along. Anyways, quick refresher on the visual cues I use to indicate who is talking in these videos. This indicates I'm paraphrasing the book. This means I'm responding to what was written, or giving my take on something. And this means I'm sharing some science, either referenced by Peterson or myself. Alrighty, let's start this off with the only sections that directly reference skateboarding. This chapter begins with Peterson talking about how kids used to skateboard outside Stanley Smith Hall at the University of Toronto. He describes how the kids, mostly boys, would skate on the rails, sometimes biting it.
Some might call that stupid. Maybe it was, but it was brave too. I thought those kids were amazing. I thought they deserved a pat on the back and some honest admiration. Of course it was dangerous. Danger was the point. They wanted to triumph over danger. They would have been safer in protective equipment, but that would have ruined it. They weren't trying to be safe. They were trying to become competent, and it's competence that makes people as safe as they can truly be.
We'll talk a little about the role of risk in development later on, but the part about safety making people competent resonated with my husband. Due to the nature of his work, he has to take a lot of safety trainings. He feels like these assume that everyone is unskilled and ignorant, and then they try to build a safe working environment on top of that. So instead of teaching people to do their job competently, and as a consequence, safely, they are essentially teaching to the safety test and calling it a day. So, fair enough, Peterson. Peterson goes on to talk about how he couldn't do what those kids are doing even if he wanted to, and other daredevil-y type things he could or couldn't do. Across the street from the building, there were concrete plant boxes the kids skateboarded along to. At some point, skate stoppers were installed. In case you haven't noticed these around before, the images here are from the Skate Stoppers website. Peterson switches topics for a sec, so we'll come back to this. The Skate Stoppers reminded Peterson of Toronto area schools removing sufficiently safe playground equipment some years prior, leaving the children with no playground equipment for at least a year.
I say sufficiently safe about the demolished playgrounds because when playgrounds are made too safe, kids either stop playing in them or start playing in unintended ways. Kids need playgrounds dangerous enough to remain challenging. People, including children, who are people too after all, don't seek to minimize risk, they seek to optimize it. They drive and walk and love and play so that they achieve what they desire, but they push themselves a bit at the same time too, so they continue to develop. Thus, if things are made too safe, people, including children, start to figure out ways to make them dangerous again.
We'll start with his reference, bring in some other citations, and then get back to the school thing itself. This literature review policy report is largely talking about the incredibly human effect that adding safety features to the driving experience doesn't necessarily make driving safer. An example is better quality brakes, resulting in people braking later and harder, which doesn't end up being more safe. To give you the gist of this document, because it is 59 pages long, people have a level of acceptable risk that they're comfortable with. Some people are comfortable with more risk, others with less. When new features or policies are rolled out with the intent of making driving safer, this lowers the perceived risk. As such, people may change their driving behavior to get back to their acceptable level of risk. An example of this is with airbags. Airbags are supposed to increase the likelihood of you surviving a crash, which lowers the perceived risk of driving, especially somewhat recklessly. So if somebody was already driving somewhat recklessly and they're now in a vehicle with airbags, they need to drive a little bit more recklessly to get back to that perceived level of risk that they were so comfortable with. To bring this back to this reference's place in the quote, it does sort of support the claim that people maintain a level of danger. However, it says nothing about the motivation behind the risky driving behaviors. Basically, this paper doesn't say that people are driving riskier with the safety things in place to optimize the danger and develop, they're just driving more risky. Besides discussion about people having differing risk comfort points that they'll try to get back to after new safety features are rolled out, there's not really any discussion about this optimal danger point that Peterson seems to be talking about. I agree that there is a shift in parenting mentality towards protecting and insulating kids from harm that took place roughly in the 90s, because I lived through it as a kid. And this coincided with a change in what was acceptable in playground equipment. Although, one paper from around that time period talked about the state of sampled playgrounds, some having equipment sitting over concrete instead of more safe surfaces as required by the safety standards. So some schools did have unsafe playgrounds. Most of the playground equipment for the elementary schools I went to was above bare ground. For where I grew up, this meant a couple inches of sand at best, or bare sandstone, just hard ground at worst. Some parts were also over asphalt for some reason. I doubt most of these met safety standards even of the day. Combine playgrounds of that nature along with the explosion of helicopter parenting, and you can see why some school districts might get a little trigger happy on just getting rid of playgrounds altogether. However, there has been a push back to the sort of thing that Peterson is bemoaning the loss of. There is growing support for managed risk in child play areas. So these are environments where the kids can turn loose, test their limits, feel fear and excitement, but in a space that is as safe as necessary. And bonus points if the kids can change the environment themselves. An explicit identification of year would have been helpful in trying to figure out more info here. From what I can tell, playground equipment has been abruptly removed a couple times in the Greater Toronto area. Sometimes without a solid replacement plan, sometimes with a mind-numbingly safe replacement. Like, ooh, I bet those kids were just stoked about walking paths and grass mazes. But this is a complex issue. Yes, helicopter parents who raise all forms of hell whenever their precious widow baby comes home with a scrape are a problem, especially when they start threatening lawsuits. But some playgrounds are absolutely unsafe and need to be changed. The articles I found indicated that school districts were having problems securing the funds to maintain the equipment, and equipment needs to be maintained. Likewise, incorporating the managed risk playgrounds would also require major funding, which schools may have trouble finding. You can see the common thread here: inadequate funding. If a school doesn't have an adequate budget to cover everything, something has to go, and sometimes that's a playground. So maybe an emphasis here should be schools need to be funded, and helicopter parents need to stop helicoptering instead of, well, you'll see. One final thought here before moving on. Some of the messaging isn't quite hanging together between what Peterson's saying here and what he said in Rule 5, which was the do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them, the parenting chapter. Some of it does. For example, he echoes the sentiment that kids need to be allowed to fail and experience bad things as a part of growing up. Some of it doesn't fully. In Rule 5, he argued that parents know what's best for their kids, and that kids can't be trusted to make choices that are fully in their best interest. Here, though, he's putting the risk judgments in the hands of the kids, implying that they can be trusted.
When untrammeled and encouraged, we prefer to live on the edge. There, we can still be both confident in our experience and confronting the chaos that helps us develop. We're hardwired for that reason to enjoy risk, some of us more than others. We feel invigorated and excited when we work to optimize our future performance while playing in the present. Otherwise, we lumber around, sloth-like, unconscious, unformed, and careless. Overprotected, we will fail when something dangerous, unexpected, and full of opportunities suddenly makes its appearance, as it inevitably will.
I don't disagree that to build your skills you need to be challenged. I wouldn't have phrased it in quite this way, but sure. I don't know if I'd go as hard on the "thou must, lest ye be unformed" language that Peterson tends to fall into if you aren't challenged, though. Peterson indicates displeasure with the skate stoppers aesthetic.
The large plant boxes have metal guards placed at irregular intervals across their tops, and this, in addition to the wear caused by the skateboarders, produces a dismal impression of poor design, resentment, and badly executed afterthoughts. It gives the area, which was supposed to be beautiful by the sculpture and vegetation, a generic, industrial, prison, mental institution, work camp look of the kind that appears when builders and public officials do not like or trust the people they serve. The sheer harsh ugliness of the solution makes a lie of the reasons for its implementations.
I tried to track down these particular skate stoppers to see how aesthetically offensive they were, but didn't have much luck. The Google Maps of the area he described, taken 2019, does show the concrete plant boxes with divides in the concrete. Those divides don't appear to house skate stoppers, although it's possible they were there before. One skateboarding message board talked about these, but only from a Peterson talked about it point of view, and there was one heck of a discussion. Regardless, people using public property in a way that wasn't intended by the designers does seem to be a contentious issue. On the one hand, these surfaces weren't designed for that type of wear, so they'll require extra maintenance than if they were being used appropriately. Those lavender plants, some of the vegetation from Peterson's quote, would be fucked if people were regularly using that plant box for tricks. So much for the nice vegetation angle. And all of this isn't talking about the bystander safety or the issue of liability if somebody gets hurt. On the other hand, the skateboarding board indicated a lack of designated skate parks in Toronto. So if a kid wants to grind a sick ollie, or whatever the skateboarding jargon is, and there's not a space around for them to do so, they're going to make do with what's around. Skate stoppers and the like are a band-aid for a deeper problem. They may stop the kids from using those surfaces to skateboard on, although some of the boards indicated that the kids just took those as an extra layer of difficulty, so good job there. But it seems like public property gets used in this way when there aren't alternatives available. The last 4 cities I've lived in, plus the town I grew up in, all have skate parks, and they get used. Last quote-related thing. Peterson makes it seem like the skate stoppers are the things dragging down the beauty of the plant boxes. But come on, it takes a lot for concrete blocks to shake the industrial building material vibe. And from looking at the Google Street Map, those are functional concrete blocks at best. To say they could ever, themselves, be beautiful is laughable.
If you read the depth psychologists, Freud and Jung, for example, as well as their precursor, Friedrich Nietzsche, you learn that there is a dark side to everything.
Name drop Patrick. If he'd thrown in Dostoevsky and Solzhenitsyn, we could have had a one-sentence bingo.
Freud delved deeply into the latent, implicit content of dreams, which were often aimed, in his opinion, at the expression of some improper wish. Jung believed that every act of social propriety was accompanied by its evil twin, its unconscious shadow. Nietzsche investigated the role played by what he termed resentment in motivating what were ostensibly selfless actions, and often exhibited all too publicly.
That would be terribly off-brand if I didn't point out the questionable legitimacy of Freud and Jung's work as they were, not counting Neo-Freudians and subsequent modifications, just Freud and Jung. For more information on that, check out my videos on those guys. He then includes a passage from that Nietzsche reference. For that man be delivered from revenge. That is for me the bridge to the highest hope, and a rainbow after long storms. The tarantulas, of course, would have it otherwise. What justice means to us is precisely that the world be filled with the storms of our revenge. Thus they speak to each other. We shall wreak vengeance and abuse on all whose equals we are not. Thus do the tarantula hearts vow. And will to equality shall henceforth be the name for virtue, and against all that has power we want to raise our clamor. You preachers of equality, the tyrant mania of impotence clamors thus out of you for equality. Your most secret ambitions to be tyrants thus shroud themselves in words of virtue. One understanding of this quote, pulled from Peterson's favorite site, Quora, is that people who push for justice and/or equality are doing it out of resentment rather than wanting the world to be better. Going a little deeper, thanks to my Discord's resident philosophers and Nietzsche knowledge person, this resentment is tied to what Nietzsche called a slave morality. So there's slave and master morality. The morality laid out by the New Testament would be slave morality, and master morality would be derived from the strong-willed person's judgments of what is good, meaning the strong and powerful, or not good, meaning the weak and petty. Resentment would be the basis of the slave morality, whereas a master is able to just talk about what's bothering them. So, with a little word algebra, you can see how this could actually be criticizing those ardently following Christianity rather than the progressives. Back to the idea of there being no such thing as a selfless act, I see. Why is it so hard for some to believe that people could want to change the world to be more inclusive and fair for more reason than some stick up their ass?
People want to help other people? No, there must be some ulterior motive behind it all.
Is it fear of change? Fear or maybe even contempt of people who don't want to live life the same way that they do? I don't fucking get it. But Peterson isn't done throwing literary quotes at us yet. Peterson then includes The Road to Wigan Pier by George Orwell, which you may remember from the Rise of Jordan Peterson documentary or my review of said documentary. He says that The Road to Wigan Pier was a scathing attack on upper-class British socialists. And then he includes a passage from The Road to Wigan Pier that talks about the lives of miners in the 1930s. Pausing for a moment here, this idea is still kicking around today. For instance, I know at least one person who is pretty meh on taking care of their teeth because dentures were just seen as inevitable. I've also heard about Americans, particularly in the Deep South, who forgo seeing a dentist up until the point where they need to have their teeth pulled and be fitted for dentures, because it's cheaper in the long run. Seeing a dentist is a relative luxury, even today. Peterson then briefly touches on working in the mine and the backbreaking nature of the work, adding that the time it took for the workers to get from the outside site where the mine started and wherever they'd be working, either by on foot or on all fours, wasn't paid. Peterson describes the first half of the book as laying out the experience of the miners, and the second half is focusing on the PR problem that socialism was having in the UK.
Orwell concluded that the tweed-wearing, armchair philosophizing, victim-identifying, pity and contempt dispensing social reformer types frequently did not like the poor as they claimed. Instead, they just hated the rich. They disguised their resentment and jealousy with piety, sanctimony, and self-righteousness. Things in the unconscious, or on the social justice dispensing leftist front, haven't changed much today.
Couple things. I have not read The Road to Wigan Pier. I've read some of Orwell's other stuff, but not this one. So the following info is being sourced from people who are more knowledgeable in this than I. So thanks again to my Discordians, as well as the Cliff Notes of the Modern Era, Wikipedia. If Peterson gets to use it as a source, so do I. I don't know how to sugarcoat this, but Peterson seems to have a bad reading of what Orwell was trying to convey with Wigan Pier, plus his other works. Let's start with the wiki summary of the book. Part 1 gives a thorough reporting of the working and living conditions of the working class in some of the industrial areas of the UK. Part 2 involves Orwell arguing for socialism as a way to improve those conditions described in Part 1. The premises here are that the working and living conditions described in Part 1 were absolutely horrible. Socialism, fully applied, could be capable of improving those conditions, so why isn't everybody a socialist? That's the central question of Part 2. Orwell then gives possible reasons why people who would probably benefit from socialism oppose it from their perspective. First is class prejudice. To quote the wiki, middle-class socialists do themselves no favors by pretending it does not exist, and, by glorifying the manual worker, they tend to alienate the large section of the population that is economically working class but culturally middle class. Second is machine worship. This point contains the idea that all technological process is inherently good, saying instead that it can also lead to laziness and decadence. Crankiness comes in third, and I'm sure you can probably guess the content of this one. The sheer volume of memes floating around about different SJWs and the unkind way they are portrayed speaks volumes to the perception of those pushing for social change. Turgid language occurs when a person busts out $10 words in a superfluous manner to the annoyance of others. Lastly, a general failure to concentrate on the basics. The core purpose should be to improve things for all instead of infighting or manifestos. The publisher was concerned with Orwell being misinterpreted to the point where he actually wrote a foreword to the book trying to keep that from happening. From the contemporary reviews, though, it seems like he wasn't 100% successful. Next is this quote from Orwell that acts as a bit of a smoking gun. Every line of serious work that I have written since 1936 has been written, directly or indirectly, against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism, as I understand it. Wigan Pier was written in 1937, for the record. Now, getting back to Peterson. Show me the receipts for this style-mad word salad. Where did Orwell say these things? Because from the sounds of it, it wasn't in Wigan Pier, at least as an opinion Orwell actually held. If you want to go into the full context of it, where it's not all socialists being painted with this brush, but those who lost sight of the people who would be positively impacted the most. Is this sentiment a holdover from his bad experience in politics as a teen?
The party operatives, I didn't like them when I was 16. I could tell already that most of them were driven by resentment. And that's when I read George Orwell. And, he said, well, the middle-class socialist types generally don't like the poor, they just hate the rich. And I thought, oh yeah, that's it. He put his finger right on that problem.
Maybe this will be a contentious statement, but does it really matter if a subset wants to affect progressive social change because they hate the rich? If we can get to a point where we're taxing even just the uber rich, and maybe corporations, and putting that money into social programs, does it really matter that the reason behind it was to get back at the 1%? The rest of society benefits from that regardless. Also, there is a pretty good fucking reason to be upset with a system that has allowed a select few to accumulate obscene amounts of wealth by exploiting their workers.
It is because of Freud, Jung, Nietzsche, and Orwell that I always wonder, what then do you stand against? Whenever I hear someone say too loudly, I stand for this. The question seems particularly relevant if the same someone is complaining, criticizing, or trying to change someone else's behavior.
Speaking of the rise of Peterson, in this clip, Peterson essentially says, loudly, he is standing up for free speech with regards to Canadian Bill C-16. He also positions himself against the radical left activists who are trying to control our freedom of expression. So it almost seems like this requirement of saying what you're standing against allows for this double-sided coin where you are saying what you're opposed to as well as controlling or shaping the narrative of your opposition. To elaborate, in that clip, Peterson says that the radical left is trying to make this about gender politics, but really it's about controlling language. Never mind that Bill C-16 isn't about controlling language, but is about protecting citizens from discrimination. That's apparently not what the radical left was really fighting for. I'm curious if it's occurred to Peterson that his refusal to use people's pronouns, compounded with his fervent denial of anything beyond two genders, at least in the West, would count as complaining, criticizing, and trying to change someone else's behavior.
I believe it was Jung who developed the most surgically wicked of psychoanalytic dicta. If you cannot understand why someone did something, look at the consequences and infer the motivation. This is a psychological scalpel. It's not always a suitable instrument. It can cut too deeply or in the wrong places. It is, perhaps, a last resort option. Nonetheless, there are times when its application proves enlightening.
I wonder if this is why it seems like Peterson talks so authoritatively about the motivations behind others' behaviors. This inferring the motivations from the outcomes seems like an incredibly stupid idea. So many actions have unintended consequences. How would you possibly know when it's appropriate to use? Plus, we're human. We make mistakes, honest mistakes even. Judging the motivation from the outcome doesn't make sense, to the point where it's even codified in our law. Intent matters. The inference Peterson makes about the why behind the skate stoppers is, you know what? Here you go.
If the consequences of placing skate stoppers on plant boxes and sculpture bases, for example, is unhappy adolescent males and brutalistic aesthetic disregard of beauty, then perhaps that was the aim.
I would guess the why behind the skate stoppers as some combination of trying to protect the property, reduce maintenance costs, and or trying to reduce the risk of kids hurting themselves or others on that property. Maybe there were some Karens in the mix who wanted power trip over the skateboarders, but it's not like there aren't legitimate reasons to not wanting kids skateboarding all over your shit.
When someone claims to be acting from the highest principles for the good of others, there is no reason to assume that the person's motives are genuine. People motivated to make things better usually aren't concerned with changing other people. Or, if they are, they take responsibility for making the same changes to themselves and first.
Has any sincere reader of this book ever thought to turn this lens on Peterson? Maybe they have, and just assume that he's already gone through this process already. I don't know. The takeaway message here seems to be to assume people are only motivated by selfish reasons. Now don't get me wrong, I'm all about questioning authority and thinking critically for yourself, but this is now gatekeeping who gets to improve the world. If someone is trying to do something good, like soliciting donations for some cause, by all means, look into the cause, see if it's something you can agree with. But this book is kind of exhausting with Peterson's near constant negative framing of everything. You don't understand anything. Don't think. Don't trust yourself. Trust the wisdom of your elders. Don't question things too much. You can't really know yourself. Take responsibility whenever things go wrong. And on, and on, and on. And I am frustrated by this claim that people who want to improve things don't bother with changing other people, with or without the caveat. Social change doesn't happen in a vacuum. Since it's kind of already come up in the video already, Canadian Bill C-16 demonstrated that some people could probably use to have their mind changed about gender. I would assume that the people who were behind and in support of the bill had already taken the responsibility for making the same changes to themselves first. Fuck.
Beneath the production of rules stopping the skateboarders from doing highly skilled, courageous, and dangerous things, I see the operation of an insidious and profoundly anti-human spirit.
Besides the seemingly inevitable Karens who may have been partially responsible for this decision, life isn't a coming-of-age movie from the 80s.
I'll finish you, your friends, and your whole damn neighborhood.
I highly doubt that most of the people involved in this decision were trying to stifle the kids' spirit. They were probably just trying to keep the kids from skateboarding on their plant boxes. Even the Karens would probably be fine with, maybe even relish the thought of, those reckless youths hurting themselves doing those dangerous stunts, as long as it was happening somewhere they weren't legally liable for. And that's it for this video. In the next Petersoning, we will be checking back in with someone from the friendship chapter, as well as seeing an environmentalism doom spiral. Until next time, bye!